Replacing Anton Watson is no easy task, but easy isn't what Michael Ajayi was looking for when he came to Spokane.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by Gametime. Folks, download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege, and you will get $20 off your first purchase. Well, we are continuing our player preview series here, getting you ready for the upcoming Gonzaga basketball season. We're discussing each player's history, how they ended up in Spokane. We're talking about their best and worst case scenarios for this upcoming season, how we think those things might shake out. We close out the show with their expected role, expected production, and then we talk about their future. How many more years could they be in Spokane? Do they have a future as an NBA player? We're going to talk about all of that. So far, we have done two of these player previews. We talked about Ben Gregg last week. We talked about Dusty Stromer earlier this week. Today, we're talking about our first newcomer to Gonzaga's roster and the first player to join the team this offseason, former Pepperdine wing Michael Ajayi. And Ajayi's history, how he ended up here, is probably one of, if not the most fascinating story on this roster. You don't see a lot of these, completely unheralded junior college kind of pop-up players end up in Spokane very often. It used to be more common. They got transfers out of the junior college level. They recruited players that were 0-star, 1-star, 2-star type players and turned them into success stories. And there's still occasionally those types of stories, guys they get in the transfer portal who weren't very heralded, or non-top 100 prospects like Corey Kispert who develop into NBA caliber talent, or of course international players where they've really thrived. But the junior college unheralded in the country players haven't really happened all that much lately. And Michael Ajayi is a great example that it still can happen here at Gonzaga, and that it's still something that we're seeing happen in the college basketball landscape. Ajayi is from the west side of the state. Played at Kentwood High School in Kent, Washington. Did not start, I don't even think played varsity till his senior year, or at least didn't start till his senior year. Was productive in his last season of high school basketball at Kentwood, but not enough to get any Division I offers. Ended up going to Pierce Junior College in Puyallup, also on the west side of the state, out in the Tacoma area. Was an absolute machine at Pierce Junior College, 20 and a half points a game, 11.3 boards. That was in 23 games. He had a 41-point outburst in one of the playoff games. Was just an all-around dominant force at the junior college level. There's some great articles. Theo Lawson wrote a great one of the Spokesman Review over the summer, kind of talking about Ajayi's growth and development, physical growth, how hard he worked to get better, to improve his game. He had some summer workouts. He worked with a lot of the Seattle area, just talent that we see in that area, and kind of got on the radar of some of those players who ended up relaying some of that information to coaches. Word got out to Lorenzo Romar, of course, from his extensive time as the coach of the University of Washington. So Romar knew many of those guys that Ajayi was working out with. They said, hey, you got to check out this kid. He's really good. He's looking for a Division I opportunity. Romar, we've criticized Romar on the show for his in-game X's and O's coaching, but he has always had an eye for talent. He has been very good at recruiting and landing and even developing talent, just not winning basketball games. And this was a great example of that. He got word of this kid, went out and saw him, knew he would be a fit at Pepperdine right away, convinced Ajayi to come down to Malibu, play for the Waves in the WCC. This was after Ajayi won NWAC MVP, the best player in that league for junior college level. So I'm sure he was going to get some other D1 love, some other D1 attention, but Romar managed to snap him up, convince him to come to Pepperdine for what is to date his only Division I college basketball season, which was last year with the Waves. And look, Romar trusted him right away. Ajayi started every single game for the Waves last year, 33 games, 33 starts, for a player brand new to the Division I level to immediately get pushed into a starting lineup. And not only that, Ajayi played 34.7 minutes per game. That is staggering. That's on par with what Ryan Nembhard and Nolan Hickman played last year. Minutes that many people thought was way too many for those guys. Of course, the lack of depth in the backcourt was the problem for Gonzaga last year, but for Ajayi to play 35 minutes a game in his first season at the D1 level is a strong indication of how much Romar believed in him, and the production that he put up was clearly indicative of him being one of the best players on that Pepperdine team and one of the best players in the conference. I mean, he averaged 17.2 points a game last year. That led the WCC. He was the highest scoring player in the conference last season. He also averaged 9.9 rebounds, 1.9 assists, and 0.9 steals. So 17 points, 10 boards, 2 assists, 1 steal per game. He shot 46.5% on two-pointers, which for a wing is not great, but it was on 10.8 attempts per game. Ajayi took 11 two-point attempts per game last season. Romar put the ball in his hands a lot and let him go to work. He was part of that three-headed monster for that Pepperdine team. It was Ajayi, it was Houston Millette, their guard, and then it was Javon Porter, their stretch 4, stretch 5, big man in the front court. None of those guys are still there. Obviously, Romar is gone. He went to LMU. Javon Porter followed him to LMU. Houston Millette transferred like before the season was over, basically, and ended up at Alabama really early. And of course, Ajayi comes over to Gonzaga. Ajayi not only shot 46.5% on twos, he shot 47% from three, slightly higher percentage from three than from two. Granted, the amount of attempts was significantly different. Like we said, about 11 two-point attempts per game, just 2.5 three-point attempts per game. And I think that's a big part of the conversation about Michael Ajayi is he's kind of being billed as an Anton Watson replacement. And Anton Watson was a good three-point shooter last year in a small volume of attempts. Does that translate for Ajayi? Does he take more attempts? Does he also remain a low volume, highly efficient three-point shooter? Does it dip? Like there's a lot of kind of questions about that three-point shooting for Ajayi. Ajayi was also about 71% from the free throw line on about 5 attempts per game. This is a guy who had the ball in his hands a lot, did a lot of shot taking, a lot of shot making. The role for him at Gonzaga is going to be different, and it'll be interesting to see how that translates. But we saw some really just monster performances from Ajayi last year. He had a double-double in 6 of his first 9 games. Just immediately had that kind of impact for Romar's team. 27 points and 11 rebounds versus Lafayette in his 3rd collegiate game at the D1 level. 31 points, 12 rebounds on 12 of 18 shooting against a very good 20-plus win UNLV team last year. 25 and 8 with 5 assists against Indiana State, a team that should have made the NCAA tournament. 16 points, 13 rebounds, 3 assists against a New Mexico team that did make the NCAA tournament. Then Pepperdine gets into WCC play. He averages 17.2 points, 10.2 boards, 1.8 assists, basically the same as the season line, just did it in conference play as well. Ajayi had double figures in 15 of his 18 conference games. 15 out of 18, he scored in double figures. He also had 10-plus rebounds in 10 of his 18 games in the WCC. Was a double-double machine. He had a 30-point, 17-rebound performance against Pacific. He had 14 and 14 in his first matchup against Gonzaga, although he was incredibly inefficient in that game. 3 of 15 from the field. Interestingly, Ajayi shot 3 of 5 from the three-point line in that game, but 0 of 10 on two-pointers. That Pepperdine team really struggled inside the arc in that game against Gonzaga early in the season. Obviously, Ajayi and Pepperdine did not advance very far in the WCC tournament. They did put the absolute skates on Pacific, but other than that, it was a rough season for Pepperdine. They exit early in the tournament again. Romar gets let go. Millette bounces to Alabama. Porter's out the door. Ajayi doesn't spend a lot of time in the transfer portal either. He commits pretty early in the process to the Gonzaga Bulldogs, but it wasn't clear that he was coming to Gonzaga right away because he also put his name in the NBA draft process and remained in the draft process until the final day, which for the record, I do not blame him one tiny bit. I always felt it was very, very likely he was going to return and come back to school. I think the staff felt similarly, but for Ajayi, he wanted to explore his options, get as much feedback as possible. I don't blame him for doing that one bit. I would do the exact same thing. The point of college is to figure out what your career aspirations are. Why not spend as much time as possible learning and getting the feedback that you can from the scouts, from the general managers, from the coaches, from everybody who's out there watching you in those in that environment. Ultimately, he decided to return to school, comes to Gonzaga. Now, Ajayi will have to balance the role that he's asked to play at Gonzaga alongside being a new teammate, being, in a new system in general, with trying to do whatever those NBA scouts and GMs told him they want to see him work on. I think a lot of those things are going to overlap. I think a big part of what Ajayi wants to be able to showcase is his ability to play in a more modern NBA style offense, which Gonzaga offers, and play more of a role as opposed to being a guy who takes 13, 14 shots a game, which is not going to be his role in the NBA. It's also not going to be his role at Gonzaga. And that's what I want to talk about now. What does that role look like? How does Ajayi adjust to being asked to play a very different role on both sides of the ball in a very different offense? We're going to discuss that through the lens of our best and worst case scenarios for Ajayi this season, all coming up in just a second. Right after we talk about FanDuel, NFL fans, you can start the season with a huge return on FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. Right now, if you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more, all on the same page where you place those bets. And you can get started right now with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Doesn't even have to be a win. Win or lose, you get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Why not use that $5 and go to the odds, 2025 national championship odds? They've been out for a while. Gonzaga sits at plus 2,000 to bring home the national championship, tied with North Carolina, tied with Iowa State, ahead of Arizona, ahead of Baylor. You put $5 down. Maybe you win some money in March. Maybe you don't. But either way, you get that $200 in bonus bets. It's a perfect, perfect deal. That's FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, folks, segment 2. Still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, still going through our Michael Ajayi season preview episode here in this segment, talking best and worst case scenarios for Ajayi in this upcoming season. I'll continue to give the caveat that I do for all of these episodes. Best case within reason, worst case without injury. If a player's best case scenario is that they win the National Player of the Year and the first pick in the NBA draft, we'll talk about it. If that doesn't feel like it's within the realm of possibility, we're not going to go to that extreme. Worst case without injury, fairly obvious. Every player's worst case scenario is getting injured and missing the whole season. The steel venters, unfortunately, as we've seen for the last couple of years. If injuries are a part of a player's history, we will discuss them, but otherwise we're going to talk about the best and worst case scenarios without injuries being part of that conversation. Start with best case scenario. The best case scenario for Michael Ajayi is that he seamlessly steps into a starting role and can play both the 3 and the 4 like his predecessor, Anton Watson. This allows the Zags to play him alongside multiple lineups. He can play the 3 in a lineup that has 2 of Ben Gregg, Braden Huff, and Graham Ike on the floor at the same time. 2 of those guys are in. Ajayi's playing the 3. They got 2 guards. Boom, that's a jumbo-sized lineup that's difficult for opposing teams to defend. You can also play Michael Ajayi at the 4 in a lineup with 3 guards, Nembhard, Hickman, Battle, Nembhard, Hickman, Stromer, some combination of those guys. Maybe even toss Innocente in there as well. And Ajayi can play the 4 with either likely Ike or Huff playing the 5. Maybe they go some smaller lineups with Ben Gregg playing the 5 as well. That versatility for Ajayi means he can play upwards of 30 minutes per game. I think looking at this Gonzaga roster, it's hard to project a lot of players to play too much more than 30 minutes per game. I think the starting guards still will, but I think a lot of guys there's going to be a lot more rotation substitutions this year just because we have so much depth in the front court and on the wing positions that I think you're allowed to do that. For Ajayi, the versatility to play the 3 or the 4 means he can be on the floor in multiple different lineups, which could lead to him playing closer to 30 minutes a game. He's not going to play 35 like he did at Pepperdine. Nobody's expecting that, but the more versatility he has, the more minutes he can play. The best case scenario for Michael Ajayi is that the efficiency as a scorer actually improves. We talked about in the first segment, he's not going to take as many shots. Even in the best case scenario for Michael Ajayi, he's not getting 11 two-point attempts per game. It is extremely unlikely that happens. Not with Graham Ike in the front court, not with Caleb Battle on the roster, not with the guards, not with there's just too many talented players there's too many mouths to feed. This isn't a team full of selfish ball dominant players, but there's just so much talent and you want to stretch the defense as much as you can. And that means you're not going to have guys taking as many shots as somebody like Ajayi did last year. But the best case scenario for him is that efficiency improves because he's not taking as many shots. Something like 60% on 2-pointers. That's a dramatic increase from the 46% on 2-pointers he shot last year. But in a system like Gonzaga's, he's going to get more transition opportunities, which are easy shots. He's going to get more just easy looks around the rim, backdoor cuts, drives to the basket where, Ben Gregg's pulling a defender away from the rim, things like that allow him to get more open looks. The best case scenario for Michael Ajayi is he shoots 60+% from 2 and 40% from 3. Maybe he improves on that 47% from 3, but I find that somewhat unlikely. I think a best case scenario for him is more that his efficiency stays the same in that area or only decreases slightly, whereas it increases on those 2-point shots. The best case scenario for Michael Ajayi is that the comment Mark Few made calling Michael Ajayi one of the best rebounders they've ever had proves to be true, and that he is fantastic on both the offensive and defensive glass this season. That he averages over 8 rebounds per game, maybe gets back to close to being in that 10 rebounds per game category. That's more likely to happen if he's spending more of his time at the 4 than at the 3, but we've seen phenomenal rebounders from guard spots in Gonzaga's past. Joel Ajayi comes to mind. There are many others who are fantastic at grabbing rebounds as well. The best case scenario for Michael Ajayi is that he gets his offensive rebounding, which was very good at Pepperdine last year, helps allow him to get 2 to 4 extra easy points per game. And the best case scenario for Michael Ajayi sticking offensively is that he improves as a passer, that he averages more assists than turnovers. Last year was 1.9 assists, 2.0 turnovers. In a best case scenario, he's not going to be a 4 or 5 assists per game guy, most likely, but he's more like 2.6, 2.7 assists per game, more like 1.5 turnovers. Slight decrease in turnovers, slight increase in assists. It just allows him to be a more well-rounded offensive player. I think having better teammates around him, having a more free-flowing offense will allow him to do those things. The best case scenario for Michael Ajayi is that he's capable of handling defensive responsibilities both on the perimeter and in the paint. He is not going to be as good of a defender as Anton Watson. That is very, very unlikely based on what we've seen from him and what we saw from Anton Watson. It's more about Anton Watson than it is about Michael Ajayi. But a best case scenario for Ajayi is that he can defend away from the rim on the perimeter, which allows him to play alongside Gregg and EK. And he can defend down on the block, defend power forwards, even defend 5s if he needs to, which allows him to play in lineups with more guards and creates some more flexibility for Gonzaga, more versatility for himself. Again, I don't think he's an all-league defender necessarily, but a best-case scenario is he's capable of defending multiple positions, which allows him to be more versatile. Best-case scenario for Michael Ajayi, he's all WCC first team again. The absolute top-end best-case scenario, he's WCC Player of the Year. It is absolutely within the realm of possibility that he is in that conversation. I think Graham Ike and Augustus Marcelonis are more likely to be in that conversation. But again, top-end outcomes, yeah, he's in that conversation for sure. And he's a strong NBA draft candidate. He's on everybody's mock drafts. There's people talking about him as a potential late first-round candidate. What are the worst-case scenarios for Michael Ajayi? Well, the skill set and or the understanding of the offense limits him to just one role. He's in a new system, his third new system in 3 years. He's being asked to learn a relatively complicated offensive and defensive system while also being kind of trying to be taught to play both the 3 and the 4. And in a worst case scenario, he kind of has to get pigeonholed into one of those roles. Not having that much versatility for Ajayi creates a situation where he's not as playable for the entire game. If he can't play the 3, for example, and he's limited to playing the 4, he's off the floor more often in lineups where, they need Ben Gregg in the game or they want Ben Gregg in the game or whatever it may be. So that would be the worst case scenario, and it limits his playing time. Now you're talking about Ajayi playing closer to 23, 25 minutes per game, maybe even less in an absolute worst case scenario because he doesn't have that versatility, either offensively or defensively, to play kind of a 3-4 hybrid role like we're projecting him to do. The worst case scenario for Michael Ajayi is that the lower shot volume doesn't result in increased efficiency. He still shoots around 46, 45% on 2-pointers. He's just now taking less of them. Whether that's because he's just misses a lot of bunnies around the rim, whether it's because he's taking inefficient mid-range jump shots, whether who knows, whatever the situation. I was going to say missing transition shots. That seems pretty unlikely, but whatever results in him not being a more efficient scorer. And the 3-point shot regresses. 47% feels high for Michael Ajayi based on looking at his shot form, simple eye test, and just kind of the metrics around him don't support him being necessarily a 45, 50% 3-point shooter. The low volume kind of stands out there. In a worst case scenario, it regresses. He's more like a 35% 3-point shooter. Or he just takes very few of them, and that limits his his ability to impact the game offensively. Defenders don't have to guard him out there. He doesn't space the floor the way that he could, and it causes some problems, some jumbling in Gonzaga's offense, and again, relegates him to a different role or a less versatile role on that end of the floor. The worst case scenario for Michael Ajayi is that learning a new system results in a lot of turnovers and mistakes. And if that fixes itself over the course of the season, it's not that big of a deal. Learning a new system is hard. Adjusting to Gonzaga's offense is difficult. He's going to have situations where he turns the basketball over because he misread a situation, or he thought a teammate was going to be in a certain spot, or he just got himself caught in midair and had to throw the ball away. Things like that are going to happen, especially early in the year. But in a worst case scenario, it doesn't really get better as the year goes on, and he finishes with more turnovers than assists and doesn't look like a player who is particularly adept at making good reads with the basketball. The floor vision isn't really there. It's something that's kind of used as a knock against him by NBA scouts. The worst case scenario for Michael Ajayi is that the bad defensive habits that he got last year carry over. And he's not a great perimeter defender. He's not a great low post defender, one or both of them. He struggles to navigate pick and rolls. And he's in a situation where he's relegated to guarding the opposing team's least impactful offensive player. It limits the amount of lineups that he can be in. Maybe they don't want to play him with Greg, or they don't want to play him with Battle because of his defensive liabilities. And it limits his ability to play 30 minutes a night. It limits the impact he can have on either end of the floor. And it limits his ability to be a WCC first teamer. He ends up not on the first team. He ends up not on the second team. And at the end of the season, NBA scouts aren't really as interested in him as they were last year. And his decision to return to school negatively impacts his draft stock after his senior season, his final year of college basketball eligibility. But what is the likely role? What is the likely outcome? As you can expect, it's somewhere in the middle, somewhere between those best and worst case scenarios. We're going to talk about what that looks like and a little bit more on his NBA potential, all coming up in just a second. Right after I tell you about Gametime, folks, going to live events is the absolute best. Whether it's going to a concert, whether it's going to a theater show, a comedy show, and now we got college sports back. Football is back and basketball is coming up very, very soon. We got that exhibition game just 2 weeks away. I'm looking forward to making new memories this season. I got plenty of games that I am planning to go to. And when you're getting tickets for this year, Gametime, it has a new feature called Gametime Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Gametime Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats so that you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. I was just looking through tickets right now for the Gonzaga UCLA game at the Intuit Dome in December. Right now, Gametime has a super deal in the lower bowl on the baseline, just $146 each. It is really hard to find tickets in the lower bowl for under $200. You can get two of them for under $150. Their all-in pricing feature allows you to find tickets that are $76 a pop up on the terrace level if you're looking to just get into the door. So you can take the guesswork out of buying tickets right now with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege, and you get $20 off your first purchase. Create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Terms do apply. Download the Gametime app today. Last-minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. All right, folks. Segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, still talking Michael Ajayi here in our season preview episode. Talked about the first big fish the Zags landed in the transfer portal this offseason. We talked about his history, how he went from a junior college on the west side of the state to Gonzaga. We talked about his best and worst case scenarios for this upcoming season and his quest to replace Anton Watson in the starting lineup. Now we're going to talk expected role and expected production. How do we think this season's actually going to play out for Ajayi here in Spokane? I think he's going to start. I think that, to me, it feels fairly clear that the three returning starters from last year, Graham Ike, Ryan Nembhard, and Nolan Hickman, three full season returning starters, are all going to start. And then Michael Ajayi is also going to be in the starting lineup. That leaves the last spot up to either Ben Gregg or Dusty Stromer or Caleb Battle. I've been on record multiple times as saying I believe it'll be Ben Gregg, which means that Ajayi will start at the 3. However, I think he's going to spend a lot of his time playing the 4. I think you're going to see a lot of situations where there's a lineup of Nembhard, Hickman, Battle, Ajayi, and then either Ike or Huff at the 5. Maybe Ben Gregg plays some 5 as well. So while I think Ajayi starts at the 3, I think he's labeled as the team starting small forward. I think he spends a lot of his time playing the power forward position. And I think he plays about 25 to 28 minutes per night. I think he does display enough versatility to play both those roles in a situation where it allows him to be on the floor more often than not. in those 3-guard lineups, as well as in those jumbo lineups where he's playing the 3 alongside 2 guards. I think we could see some potentially very jumbo lineups where Dusty Stromer's playing the 2, Ajayi's playing the 3, Greg's playing the 4, EK's playing the 5, and either Nembhard or Hickman is playing the 1. So I think there's some opportunities for some really big lineups, some smaller lineups, and I think Ajayi's versatility is a big part of that equation for Mark Few's team. I expect he's going to look a little closer to the best case scenarios than the worst case scenarios this season, particularly on the offensive end of the floor. I do think we're going to see some growing pains, in particular, just adjusting to a smaller role. This is a dude who had the ball in his hands all the time at Pierce Junior College. He had 41-point games. He averaged over 20. Like, he was the guy who had the basketball all the time. And then he goes to Pepperdine, and immediately, like I said, 27 points in his 3rd game, instantly, Michael Ajayi was the guy given the ball, his high usage rate. They put the ball in his hands. They let him go to work. They let him operate on the baseline. They let him operate in the post. They let him operate driving to the basket. He was allowed to do whatever he wanted. And now he's coming into a system where that's not going to be the case. And I think it's fair to assume there's going to be some growing pains with that. He's not the same player as Malachi Smith, so I don't really want to compare them like just straight across in terms of like what they bring to the team. But I think the trajectory of their season in Spokane could look somewhat similar. Malachi struggled a bit early on. He struggled to find his role. Now, he was coming off the bench. I don't expect that to be the case for Ajayi, but I expect Ajayi, he'll probably be one of the top options offensively, but he's not going to be number 1. Number 1's probably going to be Graham, almost certainly going to be Graham Ike. And so I don't think Ajayi is going to, again, he's not going to be pumping up 11 2-point shots, 2-point attempts per game. So I think there's going to be some growing pains, but I think he's going to find his stroke, find his kind of rhythm, and be a really impactful player for the rest of the season. Something like 12 to 14 points a game, something like 8 rebounds a game, 2 assists, fairly efficient shooting. I think we're going to be a bump up in the 2-point shooting, 46% last year. Maybe he's 53, 55% on 2-pointers this year. 3-point percentage, I think, comes down. I think it actually might come down fairly significantly, but I still project him somewhere like 38%. That's a 9% decrease from last year. But if he shoots 38% from 3 on a similar-ish volume, 3 attempts per game, maybe it's a slight increase. 3 attempts per game, 3.2 attempts per game, 38% from 3. I think you take that pretty happily. If you're Michael Ajayi, you take that. If you're Gonzaga, you take that. I think he's good enough to make the All-WCC team. I think he's good enough to make the All-WCC first team and be a strong candidate for Newcomer of the Year. I think one of the biggest competitors he'll face for Newcomer of the Year is Caleb Battle. If my starting lineup projection is correct, they'll probably give Battle 6th man of the year and give Ajayi Newcomer of the Year. Or, as we've seen in years past, they'll find some way to make sure that a player in San Francisco wins all the awards instead of giving it to the guys at Gonzaga who probably deserve it. There'll be competitors as well. Jan Vide from LMU will be in the competition. Paulos Morauskas from St. Mary's will be in the competition for Newcomer of the Year. Elijah Fisher at Pacific, I think, is in that conversation as well. Let's look at the future. Future for Michael Ajayi in Spokane is non-existent. This is it. Final year of eligibility for Ajayi. It's obviously unfortunate. We're only going to get to see 2 years of him at the Division I level. Clearly, he was talented enough to be here all along. I don't think he's complaining. I think the path that got him here is the path. How can you complain when you're here playing at Gonzaga for your final year? But it is unfortunate that we didn't get to see more of Michael Ajayi at the D1 level. But here he is. He's got 1 more year left to prove it, to do what he needs to do, to become an NBA player, to do what he needs to do to help this team win a national championship. That's what he's here to do. Looking at the NBA profile for Ajayi, obviously he had a lot of attention last year. He would not have stayed in that process until the very last day if he wasn't on some level seriously considering staying. Again, I don't know what he thought or what he knew. I think there was always an expectation that he was going to return to school, but you got to go get that feedback. And the fact that scouts were still working him out and teams are still bringing him in until that last day is a sign that there's some legitimate interest in him as an NBA player. And I think seeing him in a more modern NBA style offense will help. The big question, and it's the big question not just for Ajayi and the NBA potential, but it's for Gonzaga as well, is how he adjusts to that role. Like we said with Malachi Smith. Can he adjust to being somebody who's not the first option offensively, who is not playing 35, 38 minutes per game, who doesn't get 10 plus attempts per game? I think he'll adjust well to that. And I think that's what scouts really want to see, because he's not going to go into the NBA and be a ball dominant player by any stretch. Likely in the NBA, he's going to ask to be kind of what he's being asked to play at Gonzaga, a small ball 4 who can space the floor, who can, knock down open shots when given the opportunity. I worry about Ajayi's defense. I think it needs to look not just average at Gonzaga, but probably above average. He's a good athlete, but he's an older prospect. For me, I think the best case scenario for Ajayi in terms of NBA is something similar to Anton Watson. I don't see a reality where Michael Ajayi is a top 40 pick in the NBA draft unless he goes like absolutely nuclear this year and is like exceeds even my best case scenarios. If Michael Ajayi hits the top end of the best case scenarios that we laid out, is the WCC player of the year, averages 15, 16 points a game, 8, 9, 10 rebounds, maybe he's a late first, early second round pick. Maybe. But I think more than likely, he's a guy who goes in the 45 to 60 range of the NBA draft. I wouldn't be surprised, frankly, if it looks a lot like it did with Watson last year, where he's one of the last players picked in the draft, gets picked by a good contending team looking for an older veteran guy who can compete right away for a rotation spot, who challenges guys in camp, who's just a good veteran type player to come in and be ready to potentially impact the team right away, as opposed to a super raw 18, 19-year-old who doesn't do a whole lot for teams looking to win a championship right away. To wrap it up for me today here on the Locked On Zags podcast, folks, thank you so much to those of you who have made this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. We got more coming your way this week. We're going to talk about some of the new NCAA rules for Thursday's edition of Locked On Zags, talk about what they mean for Gonzaga. We're going to continue to do our player preview series as well. We'll keep you up to date on recruiting, talk about the Women's Fan Fest event, which is coming up this weekend as well. And of course, we got some previews coming your way for USC as we get ready for that charity exhibition coming up in just a couple of weeks. Thanks again, folks. And until next time, as always, go Zags.